1066, having won the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harold Godwin's son managed to protect his kingdom from the Norwegian invasion, but England was still in danger, since it was at this time that the fleet of the Duke of Normandy William, who planned to take possession of the English crown, was approaching the English coast. To understand why the Duke of Normandy decided that the English crown must certainly belong to him, we need to go back a few years, namely to 1041. This year, Hardicanute, King of Denmark, regained control of the English kingdom. Since Hardicanute was childless, he decided to appoint as co-ruler his half-brother Edward the Confessor, who spent almost his entire life in exile in Normandy. On June 8, 1042, Hardicanute died unexpectedly, and Edward the Confessor became the sole ruler of England. Unfortunately, Edward did not have the qualities necessary for a ruler, so very soon real power in the kingdom passed to the Godwin family. Naturally, Edward did not like this state of affairs, which is why in 1051 his confrontation with the Godwin family began. At the initial stage, everything developed quite successfully. Edward managed to expel almost all representatives of the Godwin family from England, and since the English king was childless, he decided to appoint the young Duke of Normandy William as his heir. However, the situation soon changed, and in 1052 the Godwin family returned to England with the army and forced the king to return their possessions and privileges to them. From that moment on, the power of the Godwin family only grew stronger from year to year. In 1053, Godwin died and his son Harold Godwin's son became the new head of the Godwin family. Gradually, almost all parts of the English kingdom came under the control of the Godwin family. In general, the Godwin family was lucky, but as they say, luck is a fickle lady. In 1064, Harold Godwin's son set off on an important diplomatic mission to the mainland, but on the way his ships were caught in a storm off the coast of the county of Ponthieu, and the local count immediately captured Harold in the hope of ransom. However, the count failed to make money, since Harold had to be released at the request of the Duke of Normandy. This is how Harold Godwin's son ended up at the court of Duke William, where he was treated as a dear guest, but at the same time they were in no hurry to let him go home. Duke William told Harold that he planned to become King of England after Edward's death and invited him to take an oath of allegiance in exchange for a promise that the Godwin family would retain their power and possessions after William received the English crown. Harold Godwin's son was not a stupid man and understood that he was a prisoner of the Norman Duke, and not his guest, so he was forced to swear an oath to return to William, after which he was given the opportunity to return to England. When Edward the Confessor died in 1066, Harold Godwin's son conveniently forgot about his oath and was elected King of England. Duke William, of course, did not recognize Harold Godwin's son as the King of England and declared his own rights to the English crown, recalling that he was appointed as his heir by Edward the Confessor, and also that Harold Godwin's son swore allegiance to him. Immediately after this, Wilhelm began preparations for a military campaign. The Norman Duke clearly did not have enough of his own forces to conquer England, but he managed to attract knights from Brittany, Aquitaine, Flanders and Maine into his army. In addition, the support of William was declared by the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and Pope Alexander III, who presented the Norman Duke with a sacred banner and blessed his army, which made it possible to give the campaign of conquest the image of a holy war. Duke William's luck did not end there, as the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, who at the head of a large fleet set off for the shores of England, declared his rights to the English throne. Despite the fact that Normandy was closer to the English coast, Harold III arrived in England before Duke William. Many historians attribute the delay of the Norman Duke to strong winds in the strait, which prevented the Norman fleet from going to sea. In fact, the reason was completely different. Duke Wilhelm was a very experienced and far-sighted commander. Therefore, having learned about the campaign of Harold III, he most likely simply decided to wait until the English and Norwegian armies met in battle, and then simply finish off the winner. However, to say for sure, as was actually impossible. However, the Norman fleet set sail exactly 2 days after Harold Godwin's son defeated Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Already on the morning of September 28, William's fleet, which had yet to receive the nickname Conqueror, entered the bay of the village of Pevensey. As soon as the army of the Duke of Normandy landed on the shore, it was decided to leave the village of Pevensey, surrounded by swamps, and move to the vicinity of the port of Hastings. Having reached Hastings, William ordered the construction of a camp near the city. In anticipation of the arrival of the enemy, the Duke of Normandy sent small detachments deep into Wessex to conduct reconnaissance and obtain supplies. At his very best, Harold Godwin's son, having learned about the invasion of Duke William, hastily moved towards Hastings. Along the way, Harold replenished the army, battered in the battle with the Norwegians, with local militia. Early on the morning of October 13th, Harold's army reached the outskirts of Hastings. Having learned about the approach of the enemy, Wilhelm ordered his army to leave the camp and move to meet him. The Anglo-Saxon army managed to take positions on the top of the hill, and the Norman army lined up at its foot, about 200 meters from the enemy. The Anglo-Saxon army used the traditional formation, placing 2,000 heavily armed Huscarls in the first line, which formed a shield wall. Behind the Huscarls, Harold Godwin's son built 6,000 light infantry. Harold's army had virtually no horsemen or archers, so he planned to win with heavily armed Huscarls. As for William, he built his army in 3 lines. The first line consisted of 1,000 archers and crossbowmen. The second line consisted of 4,000 infantry, and the third line consisted of 2,000 knights. He divided the entire army into 3 parts. In the center were the Normans, led personally by William. On the right flank were the French and Flemings under the command of William Fitz-Osbern, and on the left flank the Bretons, led by Alan Rufus. The battle began with Norman archers, who bombarded the positions of the Anglo-Saxon army with a hail of arrows. Despite all the efforts of the archers, their shelling turned out to be ineffective, since the enemy was on a hill, and the wall of shields formed by the Huscarls reliably protected them from arrows. Realizing that the shelling of the enemy positions was not bringing the desired result, Wilhelm sent his infantry to attack, which had to attack up the hillside. Since the southwestern part of the hill was more flat, the first ranks of the enemy reached William's left flank, consisting of Britannian soldiers, whose flank was exposed due to the lag of the Normans. The Anglo-Saxons immediately decided to take advantage of this and tried to surround the Bretons. Realizing that the situation was becoming critical, the Bretons began a retreat, which, under enemy pressure, very soon turned into a flight. The retreat of the Bretons exposed the flank of the advancing Normans, who, in the current situation, were also forced to hastily retreat. Following the Normans, the Flemish and French also stopped their attack and retreated to their original positions. Fearing that the army's retreat would turn into a flight, Wilhelm tried to restore order in the ranks of his soldiers. While William was desperately trying to restore order in his army, a horse was killed under him and news of his death began to spread through the ranks of the Norman warriors. Wilhelm was given another horse, after which he was forced to take off his helmet and ride around his army to refute rumors of his death. Having thus restored order in his army, William sent knights to attack, planning with their help to break holes in the enemy's shield wall and build on the success with the help of infantry. The onslaught of the Norman horsemen did not bring the desired result. Attacking up the hillside, the Norman knights were unable to accelerate enough to disrupt the enemy formation. Having retreated, the Norman knights again attacked the enemy's shield wall, but this attack was also ineffective. Having suffered serious losses, the Norman cavalry began to retreat. It was at this point that the Anglo-Saxons made a fatal mistake. Deciding that having repelled all the enemy's attacks, they had broken his fighting spirit, the Anglo-Saxons began a counterattack, leaving positions that were perfectly suitable for defense. While pursuing the Norman horsemen, the Anglo-Saxons encountered a very unpleasant surprise in the form of the Norman infantry, which had managed to form battle formations again. As hand-to-hand combat broke out between the English and Norman infantry, the Norman cavalry charged again, attempting to hit the enemy's rear and flank and prevent them from forming a shield wall. The scales tipped towards the Normans, who began to push back the enemy, but the English army still had a chance of victory. But it was at this moment that Harold Godwin's son died, whose detachment was attacked by the Norman cavalry. There is a version that the English king died from an arrow that hit his eye. How it was actually unknown, but after the death of the king, the Anglo-Saxon army stopped fighting and began to flee. As a result of the Battle of Hastings, the Anglo-Saxon army was completely defeated. Having won the Battle of Hastings, Duke William directed all his efforts to establish control over England. This task was simplified by the fact that Queen Edith, the widow of Edward the Confessor and part-time sister of Harold Godwin's son, who died at the Battle of Hastings, recognized the rights of the Norman Duke to the English throne, transferring to him control over the first capital of the English kingdom, the city of Winchester, without a fight. However, not all Anglo-Saxons were ready to surrender. In London, Edgar Atheling was proclaimed the new King of England, who was supposed to lead the fight against the conquerors, but after the Norman army surrounded London and devastated its surroundings, Edgar Atheling, as well as the leaders of the Anglo-Saxons who put him on the throne, were forced to recognize Duke William as the rightful King of England. Already on December 25, 1066, the coronation of William took place, who officially became the English king. In order to control the English kingdom, castles of Norman knights began to be erected throughout its territory, but despite this, uprisings against William's power began to break out in different parts of England. William the Conqueror acted decisively, destroying the centers of the uprising and ravaging the lands that supported the rebels. A little more and the resistance would have been completely suppressed, but it was at this time that another contender for the English throne appeared. In the autumn of 1069, the fleet of the Danish king Sven II Estridsson was rapidly approaching the shores of England. The fact is that Sven was the son of Estrid, the sister of Canute the Great, and therefore he decided to lay claim to the English crown, and therefore, he did not plan to remain on the sidelines of the battle for the English kingdom. Since Sven II did not have enough strength to defeat Duke William, he agreed to help Edgar Atheling in the fight against the Normans in exchange for certain territorial concessions. King Malcolm of Scotland, who was married to his sister Margaret, also agreed to support Edgar. The united army of the anti-Norman coalition managed to occupy the city of York, defeating the Norman garrison defending it. Revolts against William's power swept the entire north and center of England. To cast doubt on the legitimacy of William's power over England, the anti-Norman coalition planned to hold Edgar's coronation in York, but these plans were never realized. The fact is that the Norman army, together with the Anglo-Saxon troops who recognized William as king, was rapidly marching towards York. Upon learning of the approach of William's army, the Danish army boarded their ships and retreated. Without the Danes, the rebels clearly did not have enough strength to resist the Normans, so they hastily left York. In turn, Wilhelm decided to act as cruelly as possible, burning towns and villages along the way that supported the rebels. Many residents of northern England were forced to flee to Scotland to escape William's wrath. By the end of 1070, William's army ravaged almost all of northern England and suppressed all centers of rebellion. However, the Danish fleet was still off the coast of the English kingdom, based on the island of Ely. Many representatives of the Anglo-Saxon nobility arrived on this island, planning to continue the fight against the Normans. The rebel army carried out constant raids, devastating the coast of eastern England and destroying small Norman garrisons. William was well aware that these raids could last a long time, since the Danes managed to capture rich booty without major battles. Wilhelm did not dare to fight the Danes at sea, since in this case he would lose his numerical advantage, but the problem had to be solved somehow. In the summer of 1070, he managed to come to an agreement with the Danes, who, in exchange for a huge ransom, agreed to leave the English coast and return to their homeland. After the Danish fleet left the island of Ely, the rebels simply did not have the strength to try to challenge William the Conqueror, but they did not plan to surrender. In the summer of 1071, William's army was able to block the supply of the island of Ely and the rebels, finding themselves in a hopeless situation, were forced to capitulate. This marked the end of the Norman conquest of England. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new videos.